What's up, everybody? In the last video, we looked at the tremendous economic period known as the Roaring Twenties, and unfortunately, this was the calm before the storm. In today's video, we're actually going to look at the storm. Join me as we look at the darkest chapter in our country's economic history, the Great Depression, where the unemployment rate reaches almost 25%. Let's get started. We can't talk about the Great Depression without first starting with the stock market crash of 1929. And while the 1920s was this tremendous time economically, there was a dangerous game being played underneath the surface of stock speculation and buying on margin. People were investing in the stock market with borrowed money, hoping to make a quick profit. And when the bubble burst, it triggered a chain reaction of panic selling, leading to the infamous Black Tuesday on October 29, 1929. And when people began to sell their stock, businesses began losing capital. And when businesses lose capital, they begin laying people off. And when people get laid off, they stop buying stuff. But the problems didn't stop there. The government's attempt to protect American industries forced them to pass the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which ended up only exasperating the global economic downturn, sparking retaliation from other countries and worsening the situation. Toward the end of Hoover's term, he will begin changing course, moving away to some degree from his rugged individualistic approach to a more government-funded project approach to try to help put people back to work. One example of this is the monumental project to build the Hoover Dam, which provided employment opportunities and infrastructure development, offering a glimmer, at least, of hope during these difficult times. He also is going to sign into law the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was established to provide financial support to banks, industries, and agricultural organizations aiming to stabilize the economy and facilitate recovery efforts. However, due to the ever-increasing unemployment rate during this period of time, we're going to see the homeless rate really ramp up in the early 1930s. Desperate to find any kind of shelter to escape the elements, Americans are going to set up Hoovervilles, which are makeshift shanty towns, sarcastically named after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the economic hardships of the time. These communities consisted of tents and shacks and other crude dwellings, housing displaced and impoverished individuals and families who had lost their homes and jobs. In these Hoovervilles, individuals would use newspapers to cover themselves at night. They called these newspapers Hoover blankets. If you saw a barrel fire where people were huddled around trying to warm themselves in the winter night of, say, a town like New York City, they would call these Hoover heaters. Pockets turned inside out were often called Hoover flags. We salute you, President Hoover. The Hoovervilles are a symbolic reminder of the dire straits that many Americans during this period are facing. It's a visual reminder of the government's failures to address these economic issues during this window of time. Meanwhile, the Mexican repatriation campaign, driven by economic hardship and the rise in nativism due to the rise in competition for jobs, led to the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans, further exasperating the social tensions of the era. As difficult as this term was for Hoover, arguably the final nail that drove into the coffin of Hoover's chances for a re-election bid in 1932 was what we call the Bonus Army March. The Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans who were promised a bonus for their service in World War I. And due to economic conditions brought on by the Great Depression, they are demanding this payment early. You see, the government had promised to pay it out by 1945, but World War I veterans are saying, we need this money now. This protest highlighted the plight of unemployed veterans and the challenges they faced during the Great Depression. Ultimately, the protesters were driven forcefully off government property by men under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. And while Hoover and MacArthur tried to blame the other for that decision, optically, the American people saw a sad scene of soldiers fighting veterans. This was something that Hoover would not be able to overcome. Fast forward to the 1932 election. The American people were desperate for change, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt emerged as the beacon of hope. In his inaugural address, FDR famously declared,
"So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself."
This was his promise for bold action to combat the Great Depression. FDR was a tremendous communicator, and one of the most powerful tools he utilized at his disposal was the use of the radio. He would have what he called fireside chats with the American people, trying to calm their fears and at the same time explain the policies that he was implementing to try to bring about recovery in the nation. When it came to stabilizing the banking system, FDR didn't hesitate to take decisive action. Within the first 100 days, he declared a nationwide 4-day bank holiday, giving the government time to implement reforms and restore confidence in the financial system. Additionally, the federal government created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which provided stability to the banking system by ensuring deposits and restoring public trust in the banks. When we assess the strategy of FDR's New Deal, it's important that we understand his 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. These 3 R's are the backbone of FDR's plan to pull the country out of this economic turmoil. Some of the most impactful programs included the Civilian Conservation Corps, which provided jobs for young men. You also have the Social Security Act, which established a safety net for the elderly and the unemployed. And who could forget the Works Progress Administration, also known as the WPA, which played a pivotal role during the Great Depression by providing employment opportunities to millions of Americans across various sectors. Through infrastructure projects, art and cultural programs, and initiatives aimed at conservation and education, the WPA not only alleviated widespread unemployment, but also left a lasting legacy of public works that continues to benefit communities across the United States to this day. You'll also see programs created to address the problems on Wall Street, things like the Security and Exchange Commission, which was established to regulate the stock market and prevent another crash like we saw in 1929. You'll also see the Agricultural and Adjustment Act, the AAA, which will aim to stabilize farm prices and incomes, thereby providing relief to struggling farmers. More on that in a bit. Speaking of farmers, in the heartland, the Dust Bowl wreaked havoc on the Great Plains, driving thousands of farmers from their land in search of a better life. This catastrophic environmental disaster, coupled with economic hardship, inspired John Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath, which shed light on the struggles of migrant workers during the Great Depression. It's also important to note the work of Dorothea Lange, whose work allowed us to witness the human face of the Great Depression. Her iconic images captured the struggles of ordinary Americans, from migrant workers to displaced families, leaving an indelible mark on our collective memory of this era. However, not everyone was sold on the New Deal. Opponents like Huey Long, Father Coughlin, and even Father Townsend argued that the New Deal programs didn't go far enough to help the working class. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, you had the American Liberty League in particular, who voiced concerns that the New Deal posed a threat to free enterprise and the individual liberty of all Americans. Amidst the flurry of New Deal programs, FDR's proposal to pack the Supreme Court stands as a controversial chapter in his presidency. Frustrated by the court's repeated rejection of key New Deal programs like the AAA as unconstitutional, FDR sought to expand the court by appointing up to 6 additional judges, trying to ensure a majority that would support his programs. Presented as a means to expedite the judiciary process and alleviate the workload of aging justices, the plan was met with fierce opposition from both sides of the political spectrum. Critics argued that FDR's plan threatened the independence of the judiciary and undermined the systems of checks and balances enshrined in this Constitution. Though ultimately unsuccessful, the court-packing plan sparked a national debate and strained Roosevelt's relationship with Congress, serving as a cautionary tale of the limits of executive power and the importance of maintaining the integrity of the judicial branch. I think it's important to note that while FDR did not appoint a single justice in his first term, by the time he dies in April of 1945, he will have appointed 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices on the bench. completely transforming the Supreme Court moving forward. Lastly, we can't forget the remarkable contributions of Eleanor Roosevelt and Frances Perkins. Eleanor, FDR's wife, was a passionate advocate for social reform and played a crucial role in advancing human rights and women's rights during the New Deal era. Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member in U.S. history, served as the Secretary of Labor and was instrumental in shaping New Deal policies aimed at improving labor conditions and promoting workers' rights. As we bring this video to a close, I think it's important that we note that the New Deal did not get us out of the Great Depression. Our entrance into World War II gets us out of the Great Depression because wartime production increases, more people are back to work because we need to provide things for the war cause. That's all the time we have for today. If you liked the video, click below. Also, subscribe to our channel. And if you know someone who would benefit from this video, someone who's getting ready to take their end of the year test, please share this with them so that we can help as many people as we possibly can. We'll see you next time.